like right now portray like religion. Okay, it's like all these wars like started and they happened because of religion. And like they gave us like examples of like crusades, like these were like religious war. Do you think like religion is the primary source of conflict, or is it just like the human nature? Like,
It's human nature to fight. We fight for everything. People have fought over sports teams, the Nika riots of Constantinople, for example. It's in our nature to fight. Religion is just an excuse for doing that. For the Crusades, for example, for a lot of times, the soldiers, for a soldier, it might be religious. He might be like, yeah, this would give me salvation. If I die, God will give me salvation. But on the larger scale, the reason that the war started is usually not very not does not have very much to do with the religion. And in many wars of religion, you find people of both religions on both sides. But when Abdali attacked India, as you see in the movie Panipat, you see that on the Indian side you have the Hindus, the good guys, and then inside you have Abdali. But in reality, the Indian army had a lot of Muslims, and the Abdalis and the Afghan army under Abdali had a lot of Hindus. So usually we have a lot of mixes of people, but yeah, religion usually gets blamed for that. It's always taken as a content, like the crusades were not called because the Muslims had conquered Jerusalem. That had happened like 400 or 500 years ago. What actually had happened was that the Turks had broken into Anatolia, and the Byzantine emperor he called the Pope for help, and the Pope said, "Yeah, I'm sending an army. Let's take Jerusalem instead." There was no actual reason for them to attack Jerusalem, but they just had an army. They said, "Let's do that,"
there
and
was
he was,
another thing as well, like it was the Pope at that time. His name was Pope Urban, and like he
yeah.
did a very like he incited people at that time, because like I was reading about it like a couple of months ago, that his own position was in challenge like at that, and there
Yeah,
were people
Claremont. Yeah,
challenging him. Yeah.
he was a pope in exile. The pope in Rome was a different one. He was in Clermont in France.
And he did that speech like in France, and like after that, like the
Yeah.
people started like.
Yeah, usually that's the reason that things happen and religion gets blamed. I really think of people who sort of blame religion for warfare as people who either don't know enough or who just have a prejudice against religion. Like today, a lot of times I get into arguments with people and they're like, yeah, Muslims have an anti-Western view. And I'm like, should they not have an anti-Western view? Muslims are not the only ones who have an anti-Western view. You look at Hindus in India, they also have an anti-Western view because the West ruled us for 300 years, and then it continues to meddle in our affairs, continues to Iran, for example. People often give the example of Iran, but Iran, what crime had Iran committed? You might say that it's a religious clergy and fundamentalists and blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, the only thing that they had done was overthrow their monarch, and they have been under sanctions for 50 years as punishment for that. So who exactly is the villain in the story?
Well, then again, we have like the whole 20th century in front of us. Like the wars, they were not started because of religion.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like okay, I will come back to this one point. Like you were saying, like about we were talking about religion and like Hindustan and Pakistan. So as a Pakistani, uh, if I may ask you, like how do you identify yourself? Like what is your identity? Is it like being a Punjabi, your identity? Is it like being a Muslim, or is it like Pakistan? Because a lot of people talk about that, like over the course of last 70, 75 years, Pakistanis and Pakistan like have not been able to produce like create a national
An
identity the
identity, yes.
way India has done.
I was once sitting with a couple of friends, and somebody from Turkey, a friend of mine from Turkey, he entered the room, and I greeted him in Turkish. And there was somebody from France sitting there. And he asked me if we spoke the same language. I said we don't speak the same language, but I know some terms in Turkish. But we also have some words in common, because, and this is what I said. I said they ruled us for 300 years. What I meant by that was that they, the Turks, ruled us, the Indians, for 300 years. What I used to say was that we, the Muslims, used to rule them, the Hindus, for 800 years. But I thought about that, and I thought about how recently reading about Indian history has shifted my identity. I identify as a Muslim, a Punjabi, and an Indian. And by Indian, I don't mean the Republic of India, I mean the subcontinent of India, Hindustan, as we call it. That's primarily how I identify. And in terms of Pakistan and India, I do have a Pakistani passport, so like that is a part of it. But I personally prefer not to identify as that. Like it's a little bit like anti-patriotic, I mean, whatever the term is, but I prefer not to identify as a Pakistani, because primarily because Pakistan does not actually have an identity. We have Punjabis who sort of abandoned their Punjabi identity to become to be create this Pakistani culture, which we speak Urdu, and you see that in Lahore, Karachi, and Islamabad. But Sindhis and Balochis and Pashtun, they have sort of held on to their identities much more than Punjabis have. So there is a Pakistani culture that's starting to appear, but I don't really identify with it because I'm from a village in Faisalabad, and so I am much more close to the Punjabi culture than I am to the culture of people from Lahore. And I find them whenever I meet someone who speaks Urdu as a first language from Lahore or whatever, I don't really identify with them. I don't really think of them and me as coming from the same place.
Okay, you just mentioned like Faisalabad, and something just like came to my mind. Like it was used to be called like Lailpur
Yes,
before, right?
Lalpur.
And then they changed it to Faisalabad.
Yeah, after King Faisal of Saudi Arabia.
So, I mean, what do you think about that? Like, then if like this is happening in Pakistan, and then we go on and we criticize, okay, why are they changing the name of Allahabad to Prayagraj in India?
Uh, the thing is that the people who named Prayagraj Allahabad, I think you can do that if you want. Really, to be honest, I don't really care about names. But the people who did that, who changed the name of Prayagraj, I'm not even sure actually it was called Prayagraj before. To be honest, it's just Hindu nationalist narrative. But they were very different than the people who created the city of Faisalabad and named it Lailpur, or created the city of Lailpur. We have a very hostile history with the British. The things that they did to us was very different than the things that the Mughals did to India. The Mughals embraced India. They defended India. They genuinely loved it and gave it so many things: food, architecture, so many incredible things. They did not steal anybody's wealth and just take it back home or wherever the home was. All the wealth that they collected, it was spent here in India. So I think that's a very different legacy. And the legacy of the Mughals, it's when you attack the Mughals, you're not actually attacking the Mughals. You're attacking Muslims, Indian Muslims, what it means to be Indian Muslim. And we sort of had to define this. I actually have a video in process about this called Indian Muslim, in which, like, for us, it was sort of this, when Pakistan came to being, there were these two main ideas. One was that Pakistan Muslims and Hindus are two different nations and they deserve their own homeland, which is where the Muslim League stood and where the what was the Savarkar's people, they stood. RSS also stood in this camp, and then we had the people who thought that we can all live together, with like Gandhi and all that. But all of them ignored the very inconvenient reality of caste. We just simply took, we then had to define what it means to be an Indian Muslim. They elevated the examples in India. They elevated the examples of Akbar, these people who found room for Hinduism within Islam. And on our side, we had to define what it means to be an Indian Muslim. And we sort of took the Muslim part and we left the Indian part, which is why we call God Khuda, and namaz. We say namaz. Namaz is a Farsi word. It's a religious term of the Zoroastrians. We use it instead of just using one of the Indian terms. We never call Allah Ishwar or Vaheguru. We never use Indian terms. We have distance ourselves from Indian culture. We sort of left the Indian part. But on that side, they're now forcing people to become either Indian or Muslim. The way that we sort of did it voluntarily, I think, they are doing it of force. But the problem it was with in both cases is that only the upper castes were being considered. Lower caste Muslims or Hindus, they did not have any say in the entire matter, and they're the ones who have had to suffer the most. Like, we were able to, upper caste Muslims were able to build power here, build a different country, do whatever they want here, but lower caste Muslims were stuck there, and we left them there, and yeah, now they are the ones who are suffering there.
Okay, I don't know if you have like enough time. Like, I would love to like a little bit talk about politics as well.
Yeah, I have time.
I will get. I'll come back to that like later on. Like, I wanted to ask one or two more things. Like, okay, uh, like in India, what's happening right now? Like I think we are in agreement. Like it's not just about like historical revisionism. It's actually about Islamophobia and the hatred for
Yeah.
Muslims they have over there, and which is like because of which they are doing this stuff like right now. And a recent controversy which happened over there, like a spokesperson of BJP, like she
Yeah.
was sitting on the national television. She said something like.
About the
Uh,
prophet,
I
yes.
don't know, blasphemous, should I call it, or like derogatory or something like about the prophet, that about the marriage of the prophet. Okay, but like my question to you is like Ibn Tabari and Ibn Ishaq, actually, actually there is a reference in Bukhari as well. I don't know, like some people might not agree with it. Like, okay, there are a lot of like different sources, but like it's in Bukhari and Ibn Ishaq, and who was like who quoted this. Okay, some people do talk about his like loss of memory later on, but also like Ibn Tabari also like quoted this thing as well, the marriage of Prophet, the age of Aisha at that time. Well, what do you think about this whole I don't know what should I call it, like, but this because she had to like later on resign from her position, and now like there are protests like
Yeah.
in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan.
I think the Indian Muslim leadership is really stupid. To be honest, they should not have held protests like this. But yeah, well, that's a different case. So you're talking about like the age part. Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, yes, precisely.
I think for a lot of Muslims, it's sort of like cognitive dissonance, and we just live with it. We don't think too much about it. We just like, yeah, okay, the age was that. To be honest, in my opinion, i don't really uh I don't really think that the hadiths, etc., on ages are accurate. And even if they are, there was a totally different time. It was a totally different time. It should be judged by totally different standards. And a lot of times when criticism is sort of thrown at Islam, people always make it when something like this is said, that they always make it a freedom of speech issue. uh it's most like, she did not mean for it to be a criticism. She genuinely thought that the Muslim guy, I don't know if it was Muslim. I actually don't remember the debate. I saw it, unfortunately. But I don't remember he said something about shivling being a fountain, which I think in my opinion is right. It's a fountain. Similarly, a mihrab is just a stone. If a mosque is destroyed, it hurts our sentiment, but it's a mosque. It's a building, and Muslims don't need more mosques. Mosques need more Muslims. So it's like that. But in that case, she hurled this insult basically to incite people, to provoke people, and that's the point that is more important here. Um, that the world's biggest democratic party is trying to deliberately provoke a huge portion of its population. In terms of that issue, the age issue, in my mind, that is really not like, the sources are not all that accurate. And even if they are, it was a long time ago. Different morality, we should judge different morality by different things. Like, I was talking to this professor. She did her thesis on sort of the sexual identity of people in the Ottoman era. And there's a lot of interesting things. For example, today we talk about consent in sexual things, but like, did the kings have consent of the concubines that they took? Probably not, but we don't really judge them by that, because it was totally different standard, totally different time, totally different standard. It really doesn't matter.
Uh-huh. Okay. Um, so like I'll I have like a personal question. Like, you have been living in Germany for a while now. Like, do you feel a sort of like a cultural estrangement, like living in this foreign land?
Yes,
And
very
how do you
much.
deal with it?
How do I deal with it? I haven't really dealt with it. um I'm not very outdoorsy or extroverted, I guess you can say. So I've never not really, and also I don't speak German, so I do feel that alienation as well. And usually I sort of feel entitled that I speak English. We won the war, so I should not have to learn German. But yeah, there's a lot of cultural alienation. I read about that in Faz's biography. His wife told their daughter that she should not marry someone outside her culture, even though like she had. And so I was thinking that, yes, that's very much true. That even for us, it's to adjust into a totally different culture. It's very difficult, and to make friends and to like when you meet some friends and they're Germans, they want to speak German with each other. They feel awkward speaking English, but they have to because you're there. So
Mhm.
it's weird. It's awkward.
Okay, yeah. So now like, I will get to the like last part, like which I wanted. I don't know how much time do you have, but like we will just like talk about politics a bit. And so, what do you think? Like, what's your political opinions? I don't know, like if you're comfortable sharing your political opinions, like publicly, but your videos, like obviously, like it's more related to history. But like, what do you think, like about like the stuff that is happening back home in Pakistan? I'd like to listen to your political opinions as well.
Okay, well that's this the thing is that my political opinions are too well, I think everybody's political opinions these days are too controversial to share publicly. Yeah, if you want to return back home someday. So yeah, but I do hope that things get better soon. There's the potential that our country had and the way that we've destroyed it, it truly is a tragedy.
And who do you think is the like mostly like responsible for that? Is that the military? Is that the politicians?
In simple, it's the military.
It's
It's
simple.
it's very simple. It's very simple. Like for 1400 years, we've seen this pattern, and this is on my Facebook. I often post whenever something happens, I compare it to the Abbasid Caliphate because what's happening in Pakistan is exactly what happened in the Abbasid Caliphate and its decline. And you have the military establishment, which is corrupt, which is trying to hold on to power. It's installing puppets, and meanwhile, it's just taking out money from the treasury for its personal usage. And so at the end of the day, there's no money for defense or anything, and then there's a public riot, and that generally is how I see Pakistan going. Could be different, but yeah, I personally blame not just the military but also the politicians because at the end of the day it's about the money that has left our country and has gone to. That's why I say that not much has changed. There was a time when the British had to use guns and muskets to take our money, and today we just hand it to them to buy flats in London and pizza chains in Canada and all that.
No,
So
but like
not
our
much has.
politicians have also been like doing the same stuff. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the politicians that they have to like stand up to this military, this cabal of like corrupt generals. And none of the politicians actually have managed to do that. Like,
They
and
they
they at the
cannot.
end of the day, they cut their deals and like they get their cut in the share, and that's it. Like,
They can't do that actually. Like again, same as the Abbasid Caliphate. Uh, our institutions are so weak that the military, as when Pakistan came into being, our institutions were so weak that we simply the only institution that worked was the military, and the military started to gain more and more power. And our constitution is one of the worst written documents ever in the history of humanity. That document is not even worth. I don't want to say anything that could be considered treason, but that document, like all of it has been designed. Like for example, look at just one law. You can contest an election for multiple constituencies, and then you can just, if you win for multiple ones, you can keep one. That is simply designed to waste public money in order to ensure that a particular politician sits in the cabinet or in the parliament. Stuff like that. This has been particularly designed. The country has been particularly designed for this thing. The country is there's nothing wrong with the country because it is designed to perform this way, and the military simply has too much power because the public backs it up. Without India as the great villain, we would actually not have such a strong military.
do you think like this is also like the issue of Kashmir, like it has been like kept alive by the military so that it gives justification to its existence and the budget, the share in budget they are taking?
Yeah, I have a friend in Israel, and I once asked him why exactly does Israel not annex Gaza and just end this? And he said because then the politicians will have nothing to talk about. And I was like, yeah, okay, this is exactly what's happening in Pakistan. That the only reason that we've kept these issues alive is because they're profitable for us. And that's exactly what happens. No matter how much you work against the military or against whatever kind of establishment you want to fight, at the end of the day, it's simple. You one Rafael jet flies over Lahore, and yeah, we're all behind the military again.
Uh-huh. And like the recently, like what happened, like, it was the first time like the people actually came out, like, and they chanted obviously not in like huge numbers, but still like it was a first event that they were standing outside like GHQ and they were chanting slogans against the military leadership.
Yeah.
I think like it will have some like long-term consequences, if not the short term. I
You know
hope
what I think?
short term as well, but yeah.
I think on the other side of the border, there's problems as well. I think what's going to happen is a tiny little war, or just a small conflict, something like what happened in February 2019,
Mhm.
and then it's all business as usual. You just really cannot. In 1400 years, no Muslim empire has ever overthrown military establishment, and I don't see a way out of it.
Really? Then do you think what's the reason behind that? Like if we see now we have like 57, 58 like Islamic countries and there is not, I don't know, there's democracy in Turkey and like the condition it has right now is also like quite debatable. Then there is like a sort of like a theocratic democracy in Iran. Then we have democracy in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Like, do you think like democracy is in like, is it compatible? Like a lot of people talk about that. It's not compatible with like, Islam and like the Muslim mindset or whatever.
No, you can blame the Muslim mindset, but to be honest, has democracy really worked out in India or other in Africa, in all these countries? Because we're not really, it's not about Muslim mindset, it's about Eastern mindset. Like I mentioned before in the West, people had power, so they sort of, democracy was sort of a natural jump up from that. But in our world, the people never had any power, so they never really imagined that. So we are used to living in sort of this serfdom below in sort of this particular ranks. If you gave everybody in Pakistan, like let's say 10 million or 10 billion rupees or whatever, everybody wants to be special in Pakistan, and that's sort of the problem with the whole thing. And same with most of the world. Democracy is not incompatible with Islam; it's incompatible with our society, our many Eastern societies from Africa to Iran, Middle East, Pakistan, and even China and like the Southeast Asia.
Yeah, like you see that like in Vietnam as well, like in South Korea as well.
Yeah.
It was the dictators who actually built up those countries.
Yes.
In China, we have another example. Yeah, in Latin America, democracy has also not like flourished. Like,
Yeah.
is it because like it's more of a Western concept and the Eastern or
People
like the Southern people have not like adopted to it, or is it still the colonial baggage like which like maybe 70, 80, or 100 years is not like a long time in the life of a country?
Yeah, that is also the case, but there is a certain amount of colonial baggage. That's true. But for example, look at South America. The public has been disabused of the idea that they have any will.
Mhm.
Whenever they elect a public, if they elect a communist regime, CIA used to overthrow them. CIA used to overthrow elected governments. They did that all over the South America. France did that all over Africa. So we do have a certain amount of colonial imperialism alive as well. But also, I think democracy, it's actually not a very good thing. But the reason that it exists so strongly, the Western people, they sort of think that they have sort of this higher civilization than we do, which is ruled by the law and everybody is equal, and they trust the government. But that's not actually true. How would you replicate the Western model somewhere? How would you do that? How would you build trust among, if this went wrong, how would you build trust again? The trust that everything stands on was bought by colonial money, by American gold, by African wealth, all of these things. They built empire. When they run out of money, when now, for example, with the Russian invasion, I think that when they run out of money, or when these things start to dwindle, when German public transport system and education system starts to dwindle, when their healthcare system starts to dwindle, they're going to reveal exactly how hollow democracy actually is. And look at France. I think something like 92% of the people who voted for Macron in this election, they didn't vote for him. They voted against
Yes.
Marine Le Pen. Is that really democracy? This way, you can actually elect Hitler in Israel if you just chose his opponent right. That's democracy. That's like, what is that exactly? And so I don't know. I'm very pessimistic. I think of us humans as still savages, as still the same people that we were. We just have new terminologies. We just have new veneers, but at the end of the day, we're the same. And we just, our part of the world, we're poor, and so we just look like we're failing. And but at the end of the day, everybody's failing.
Yeah, then again, like I would say, do you think like it's because of the good economic conditions like in the Western hemisphere that they have like a higher standards of morality? And if we look towards like the Eastern, because like democracy does work like in, if you have like a moral code in your country, if you have a sense of morality. And we look like in back home, like in Pakistan, we don't like, I mean, there is a crisis of morality in our country. There are a lot of things people do, and a lot of immoral things they do, like corruption and lying and deceit, but they still like, I mean, considered acceptable in the society. So do you think is the material economic conditions, they are somehow related to the morality, and at the end of the day, it is also related to democracy as well?
To a large extent, yes. For example, morality in terms of, let's say, corruption. When a Pakistani politician accepts money from a corporation, that's called bribery. But when an American politician accepts money from a corporation, that's called lobbying. They have legalized corruption, and so the American population does not actually have any power anymore. 98% of them want background checks on the purchase of guns, but they haven't been able to pass that. In France or in the UK, like the UK, look at what happened in the UK. That turned to shit. And similarly, Germany and Scandinavian countries, they're the only healthy democracies in the world at the moment. And they're actually the only, I think, healthy moralities as well, because the people have enough to eat. When they don't have it, when there isn't enough to go around, I think morality begins to, a very pessimistic view of mine might be, but I think morality begins to come down. And yeah, in Pakistan, for example, because we don't have enough resources to go around, we think of it as you use whatever you have to get ahead. You use bribery, you use references and all that. And here you don't need to, because there is enough money. Like you go to an office in Germany, a government office, and you start to see exactly how much money there is and how many people there are working in the office. And you just, for me, it's always like, there's too many people here. There should not be this many people for this job. I go to my university library and there's like 8 people there for no reason, like at the checkout counters and all that. And I always feel like that's, maybe it's just a benefit of they've employed everyone and everybody has money coming in, going out. And so morality exists. But if that wasn't the case, I don't really think morality would exist.
Okay, now I'm getting a bit of an idea of like your an understanding of like your idea of like, you know, you're talking about democracy, and then there's, I can see that that burst of marks which is like right behind you. And we're talking about the United States and the West. Like, okay, let me put another question to you. That what do you think, like after seeing the last, like the, you know, the 20th century, and the United States, the foreign policy of United States, what it has done in the last like whole century, and like continue this to the 21st century as well, what they have done in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya.
You cannot see it, but I have a book called Dirty Wars here by
Okay.
Jeremy Scahill, which is about about the invasion of Iraq and the way that the US justified all of that. The CIA is a terrorist organization. It is not very different than any other terrorist organization that has operated in the world. They have committed extra legal assassinations. They once bombed Gaddafi's home because he was linked by some agency to a bombing that had happened in Berlin in the 1980s. So it is an extension of Western imperialism. The US is doing the same thing. It has destroyed elected governments. I mean, you know, it pretends to be this harbinger of democracy, but it destroyed so many elected democracies in South America. It has not allowed any major power to exist on the American continent. And like, look at Russia and Ukraine. You can say that Russia is attacking Ukraine and Ukraine is innocent. It is, I think. But imagine if Russia had made ally with Mexico. The US would have leveled Mexico by now. They actually did that when the Americans put missiles in Turkey during the Cuban Missile
Yeah,
Crisis.
the middle crisis. Yeah.
Yeah, that was huge and horrible display of hypocrisy. That is just the US. Like, how can they actually pretend to have any morality? And what they're doing to China now, the only reason that they're sort of highlighting China as this evil whatever is because China is competing with them economically, and they're afraid for their economic power, and they're afraid of their hegemony.
Do you think like you were talking about China and do you think the kind of press which China gets, like especially in the Western or the so-called like international press, eh, like at the back of their minds, like especially the functioning of a like a white male mind, that they remember what they have done like during their colonial empires, and to some extent they do fear from China that what they have done like in the name of colonialism, that at some point in future China will do something similar, and though it's actually the manifestation of those fears that we see in the international media. What do you think about that?
I think the West is afraid of having someone do to it what it did to others.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think they are afraid of that, and so sort of this narrative was built, where like I said before, that corruption is lobbying in the U.S., but it's corruption in China. Billionaires are billionaires in the U.S., but oligarchs in Russia. So that sort of selective use of language, negative use of language, use of negative language about China sort of makes us look closer at that. Yeah, this is bad. We should keep an eye on that. But actually, it's the same thing. When you look into the details, it's the same thing. And now the only reason that they're doing all these things, all this sheer propaganda that they've done against China, is simply because of that. I mean, I think in Hungary there was this university that's being opened by Chinese funding, and the mayor of the city changed the name of the street to Free Tibet and Dalai Lama or whatever, something like that. But Israel does the same thing. But Israel is an ally because it's the colonial baby of the West, and so it's just sheer propaganda, hypocrisy at a level that is truly remarkable.
And recently Israel actually canceled a game, a football game against Russia, because
Yes.
some sort of like they are waging war against Ukraine. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Maybe they're doing something different in Gaza and the West Bank. What do you think about
Yeah, it's the same thing, but it's about the narrative. You have to think about that. You have to think about, like, in nuances it's the same, but no, it's somehow different. And yeah, it's just
Okay,
hypocrisy.
okay. I will ask one last question. Like, okay, you have been living in Germany for a while now. Like, okay, when we saw this like recent war, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were like huge protests. Like, so I also went to one of the protests here in Berlin, and there were huge protests all over the Western capitals and like other big cities. But we don't see a similar kind of outrage when a similar like invasions, like maybe like a country which is allied with the Western Hemisphere,
Yeah,
like Saudis doing in Yemen, or Israel does it in
yeah.
Palestine. We don't see it. Do you think the people in West, they're also like brainwashed by their media?
Yes, very much so. Very, very much so. Like I said, like in 1984, he mentions about the use of language, and I really have started to focus on the fact that the language is very important. First of all, Russia has been cultivated as the great Western villain for the last 500 years, pretty much since the time of Ivan the Terrible. And every single time you have Russophobia at a ridiculous level, and so now its invasion has been this has been done. Similarly, Iran has been vilified. Even SNL back in, I think John Ghaznavian mentioned that once, back in 1979 when they overthrew the Shah. SNL made sketches making fun of dehumanizing Iranians, and so there's like propaganda. It's a ridiculous amount of propaganda that's done, that's painted. Now people were actually the reason behind this so much outrage with Ukraine was, first of all, with Russia. Russia is the great European villain, but also because Ukrainians are white. And there was like relatively civilized and blue-eyed and blonde, and yeah, but Ukraine is sort of the peaceful. But when the same thing happened to blue-eyed blonde Muslims in Bosnia, no one said anything, because the Balkans, they see that as this destabilized region. Like, this happens there, it's like, what else is new? But with Ukraine, they were shocked. So yeah, media and language play a very important role. You call it invasion, like, intervention, with when the U.S. Attacks someone, it's because the U.S. is protecting its interests. But when the Russians do something, it's a blatant human rights violation, uh, in the shape of a war and all that. The same thing they did in Iraq. The U.S. did that. They tortured people. They tortured the Taliban to force them to tell them to say that Iraq was responsible for training the Taliban, something that was totally, completely untrue. And Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney used that as an excuse to invade a perfectly simple country that had nothing to do with anything, but they invaded that. And it's the same thing. How is that any different? Even Bush recently confused that. He said something about that.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Okay, not to take away anything from the people of Ukraine. They are the only
Yes.
people like who are oppressed in this conflict. So, what I mean, it's the war of like Russia and the West, but like the people of Ukraine, like my sympathies and our sympathies are with them. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity and time, Suresh. It was lovely. I quite much enjoyed talking to you. Hopefully, I would love to like invite you again later on at some point to the podcast. And thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me. It was really nice talking to you.